Hello there. If you're just getting started with Raspberry Pi or you've been around for quite a while, one of the things that is always important is setting up your Raspberry Pi, especially in headless form. But because of the recent upgrades in Raspberry Pi hardware architecture and also in the new releases of Raspberry Pi operating system, things are now becoming more difficult to set up, especially in headless form. If you have your keyboard, your mouse, your monitor, you can simply plug in these peripherals into the Raspberry Pi and you'll be good to go in no time. But if you're trying to set up your Raspberry Pi in headless form, this video is for you. In the previous releases of Raspberry Pi operating system, when we have the stretch and the buster, it's not that difficult to set up your Raspberry Pi in headless form. But because of the new releases of Bookworm and Bullseye, things are now becoming more secure and also more difficult to set up, especially in headless form. In this tutorial, I'll be setting up Bullseye on Raspberry Pi 4. This will also work if you have Raspberry Pi 3 or downward, except for Pi 0. And in another tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to set up this operating system using Raspberry Pi 0. Before we proceed, you should know that there are two ways this can be done. You can either use the Raspberry Pi imager, but the trade-off is that you have to be online while doing it. So most students and hobbyists prefer the second method, which is downloading the Raspberry Pi operating system file and manually writing it to the SD card. And that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. So let's get started and set up your Raspberry Pi in headless form.
So to begin, open up your browser and we'll be downloading some softwares that you need to set up your Raspberry Pi in headless form. There are different softwares that you need before you can set up your Raspberry Pi in headless form, and I'll be careful to state the versions of the software that are currently available at the time I'm making this tutorial, because if you are watching this tutorial in the future, the UI might have changed. But the first thing you have to do is to download the Raspberry Pi operating system. So to do this, I'll simply go to raspberrypi.com to grab the operating system file. And by the way, at the time of recording this tutorial, Raspberry Pi just released their new hardware upgrade, which is Raspberry Pi 5. I don't have a Raspberry Pi 5 myself. I currently have a Raspberry Pi 4, and I'll be using that in this tutorial. Don't forget, if you have a Raspberry Pi 2, 1, this can still work. So to do this, just come to software, and there we can download the Raspberry Pi OS. So another thing to take note, as I mentioned before, is that there are two ways this can be done. You can either go through this first way, which is install using Raspberry Pi imager, but for this tutorial I will not be using this method. I'll just go to the next method, which is manually install an operating system image. I'm going to click on see all download options to see all the options of operating system that are currently available. And one thing I want you to take note is that Raspberry Pi operating system do change over time, and at the time of this tutorial, the latest version was just released last month. I'm making this tutorial in November 2023, and the latest version was released October 2023, which is named Bookworm. So I usually have fear of downloading the latest version, especially if it's just a month old, because of some compatibility issue. So I'll just go straight to a more stable version, which is Bullseye, which was released a while ago. So I'll just skip over this, but whether you are using Bullseye or you are using Bookworm, this method is still going to work. So I'll just scroll down to download Bullseye. It's legacy already. Yes, we have different options. We have Raspberry Pi OS legacy with desktop. That's the first one. If you check here, we have the Debian version, which is Bullseye, the one we are going to be using for this tutorial, as I mentioned. So this was released this same year, May 3rd, 2023. So we are now going to go straight to download. Let's just check all the available options that we have. We have Raspberry Pi legacy, which is desktop. This comes with a graphical user interface for you. We also have with desktop and some recommended softwares. So this comes with softwares like LibreOffice, VLC, and some other softwares that you might need. And we have the Raspberry Pi Lite. This is a lightweight version, just terminal. So we also have the Raspberry Pi OS Legacy 2, which is the same thing as what we've seen above. And we have some other versions of Raspberry Pi OS, which is Raspberry Pi Desktop. This is if you want to use your Raspberry Pi OS on your normal computer. So I'll just go straight. You can choose any of these download based on your preference and what you are planning to use it for. But again, I'm going to be downloading Bullseye for this tutorial, and I've grabbed the Raspberry Pi OS Legacy with desktop. I'll just click here to download this, and then the download will start at once. So once the download is done, we proceed and grab the other two softwares that we need. So we're going to need a software to format the SD card that you want to use. If you're using a new SD card, it's just a best practice to also format it before you write the OS into it. But if you are using an old SD card that already has something, so it's important for you to format it. So to do this, I'm going to grab another software called SD card formatter. Just search it, SD card formatter, in your window bar, and then under SD association, I'll just click on this, and this will lead me straight to where I will download the software. So I have the page here, and I'm just going to grab for Windows, which is what I have here. So clicking on this, so after accepting some licenses, the download will start immediately. So it's just very little, just 6.1 MB, and you have that. So let me quickly go also to download the last software that I'm going to be using, and this will be the software we use to write the operating system from our computer to the SD card. And for this tutorial, there are different softwares that you can use to do this, but I personally prefer using Balena Etcher. You can use Win32 Disk Imager, you can use Rufus, but I personally prefer Balena Etcher. They have a very good UI. So you just clicking on searching for Balena Etcher. So go to etcher.balena.io to grab the software, and I'll be downloading for Windows. So just this leads us straight to where I can download. So clicking on download, I have different download options, and I'm using Windows currently, so I want to download for Windows 64-bit installer. I'll just click on this, and my download will begin at once. After downloading the softwares, go ahead and slot in your SD card into your computer using a card reader. So I'll just slot in mine, and you can hear the sound. So I'll just open up the SD card formatter to format the disk. So once I open this up, it automatically picks my SD card, which is this. For this tutorial, I'm using an 8 gig. You can have a 32 gig, a 16 gig, or 64 gig SD card. Just for this tutorial, I'm using an 8 gig SD card. So I'll click on format, quick format, and then yes. So once the format is done, it will show you it's done successfully. So the next thing you want to do is to write the OS into the SD card. So I'll just close this once. If you go to your file manager, you'll be able to see that this is the SD card, and then currently there's nothing on it. So what I need to do next is to open up Balena Etcher, and I said we are going to be using this particular software to write the operating system that we downloaded into the SD card. So you have to click on Flash from File and select where you have your Raspberry Pi operating system downloaded. So currently I'm using the version 2023-0503 Raspberry Pi OS Bullseye. I'll just click on this and click on Open. So I'll click on Select Target and click on my SD card. So click on Select and then click on Flash. So this will take just a little time. So I have 1 minute 26 seconds there. So let's just wait for it. Once it's done, we continue the tutorial. Once you start flashing, it will pass through different stages, through validation, flashing, and then once it's done, we have this message that says flash completed. So once it's done now, I'm going to just remove the SD card, and then I will plug it back in. But before I plug it back in, let me just make a quick comment here. If you are setting up your Raspberry Pi with a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, that's all you need to do. You can just plug in straight to your monitor, plug in your keyboard, plug in your mouse, and you'll be good to go. But because the aim is to set up a Raspberry Pi in headless form, I have to slot in back the SD card into the computer to make some changes. So again, I'm going to slot in back. Don't forget, I've not even used my Raspberry Pi here. I will close this, and then here I have, instead of showing the name it was showing the other time, which is First Eagle, it's now showing boot FS. So I will double click on this to open this up, and then I have the operating system files. So before you can access our Raspberry Pi in headless form, we need to enable the SSH protocol, because we're going to be accessing our Raspberry Pi through SSH and also through VNC. But for now, what you need to know is that you have to enable SSH on the Raspberry Pi. If you are using a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, there's a way you can enable this using the graphical user interface. Because we don't have the luxury of these verifiers, we need to do this manually. And to do this, we need to create a file inside this particular folder called SSH. So to do that, just come to this search bar and type cmd. Once I type in cmd, it will open a terminal to this particular folder. You can see here we have e/. which is where I am currently in. So just type in echo greater than SSH. It has to be a file without an extension. So echo greater than SSH. We create an ordinary file without an extension in this folder. So I'll run this and then I can minimize it. And if you scroll down, you see that a file has been created, SSH, with no extension, just SSH. So after that, you might be good to go if you are using some other versions of Raspberry Pi OS like the Stretch or the Buster. But since the updates in Bullseye and Bookworm, we need to do two different things before you can use this operating system on a Raspberry Pi. First, we need to set up a user profile. In the other versions of Raspberry Pi OS, you can just start. The default username will be Pi and the default password will be Raspberry. But since the development in Bullseye and some of the security features that came along with it, you have to manually set up the user configuration yourself before you can use the Raspberry Pi. And also, before you can connect to the internet, you also have to manually set up everything before you can connect to the internet. So two things I'm going to be doing now. I'm going to be setting up user configuration and I'm going to be setting up connectivity to internet. So let's get straight into it. In order to set up the user configuration, we need to create a file also inside this folder, just like we created for SSH the other time. But in this case, we have to call this userconf.txt. So again, I will open up the terminal and I will type echo greater than userconf.txt, and this is where I'm going to put my user configuration. So here I have it underneath here, so I can double click this and I'm going to be editing this as my user configuration file. This is very important and this is a must starting from Raspberry Pi Bullseye upward. If you are using Buster or Stretch, you don't need to do this as I mentioned earlier, but if you are on Bullseye or you are on Bookworm, you have to do this. So what we need to put here, we have to be in this format. We are going to put the username and put a colon and put the password, and this will be the password. Sorry for my spelling. So this will be the password and the username that the Raspberry Pi will use. But we're not going to put the password directly. We have to put the encrypted form of the password. Take note, we are going to put the username as the normal username, but we have to put the encrypted form of the password. So for this, I'm going to be using Pi. I've just used Pi as the username, and I'm going to be using Raspberry as the password. But don't forget, I can't use Raspberry straight. If I use Raspberry, it's not going to work. I need to put the encrypted form of Raspberry. So what I need to do here is that if you are on a Linux computer, if you have a Linux computer, this might be quite easy. But if you are on Windows, you need to open a Linux terminal before you can do this. So I will go back to my browser and I'll try to use a Linux shell in my browser. So if I go to this website, bellad.org/jslinux, I will have access to a Linux shell. And here I'm just going to click on this first option that I have here, which is Alpine Linux 3.12. So clicking here, this will open a Linux terminal for me, and I will type in a command that will change the Raspberry Pi into an encrypted form of the password. And Raspberry Pi is currently using OpenSSL to encrypt the password, so you are going to be using OpenSSL that is available using bash shell. So let's wait for this to load and we type in the command. So once this is done loading, we're going to be typing the command OpenSSL space PASSWD and -6. I will click enter here and it will ask me for the password that I want to use. So remember, this has to be the password you want your Raspberry Pi to use. So I'll type in the Raspberry, and take note, it's not going to show because it's password. Click enter again and it will ask you to verify the password. Again, type in the same word and enter. So once you are done, it's going to show you an encrypted form of the password that you just typed. So I'll just copy this. So copy this, right click and copy, and I'll just go ahead and go back to my userconf.txt and paste this in. take note it has to be on the same line. So what I'm doing here is simply pi, which is the username, and putting a colon. I put in the encrypted form of the password. If you are on Linux, you can simply type this same command on Linux and you get the same thing. But if you are not on Linux, just use the method that I'm using here. Go to belad.org/jslinux and you have access to a Linux shell. So once you are done, you can click on Ctrl S to save this, and we are done setting up the user configuration. Next, you are going to be setting up the connectivity to internet. You might not need this if you don't want it to connect to internet, but sometimes before you can establish SSH connection, you don't want to use wire, you want to connect it over wireless. So you might want to use hotspot. So next we're going to be looking at how we can set up hotspot before we put in the Raspberry Pi SD card into the Raspberry Pi. And lastly, to set up internet connectivity, I'm going to be creating another file again inside the same folder. Don't forget, you still have your SD card plugged into the computer, and in this case I'm going to be calling this WPA supplicant, WPA underscore supplicant .conf. So this file will be called WPA underscore supplicant .conf. So enter this, and if I go back here, I have the file already created, which is WPA supplicant. So I'll just right click on this to open it using Notepad. Open with Notepad. Okay, just clean this off, and I'm going to be inputting the following text inside the file. So I'll just type this out. So the first thing I have to put is the country, and now this is currently being recorded in Nigeria, so I put country equal to NG. You have to put the ISO equivalent for your country. If it's the US, you have to put US. So again, move to the next line, type CTRL, which is control interface. So this is what you are going to have inside the text file. Here you are going to put your network SSID, which is the name of your hotspot, and here you are going to put in the password. So leave this second line the way it is and the last line the way it is. So just edit the SSID to be your network SSID and PSK to be the password. So once you are done, you can click on Ctrl S to save this and you can close it. So with this, we are done setting up everything we need to do on the SD card. So now I'm going to remove the SD card and I'll plug in straight into my Raspberry Pi, and I'll try to make this connection using Putty. For us to be able to access our Raspberry Pi remotely, we're going to be using the software called Putty. So this gives us ability to access our Raspberry Pi via SSH. And don't forget, we have already enabled SSH when we echo SSH without extension into the SD card root file. So I'll just type Putty to download the software. So it brings it on the first line. I'll click on this and I'll be able to download Putty. So go through this and click on download. You have Putty installed on your computer, and if you want to be able to access the GUI of the Raspberry Pi, we won't be able to access the GUI over SSH, so we need to enable VNC. But hold on for that, hold on for now. So but the software we are going to use for us to access the Raspberry Pi over VNC is called VNC Viewer. So I'll just click on VNC Viewer, and clicking on this, I'll be able to download VNC Viewer. And then click on Windows. If you're on Windows, if you're on Mac, if you're on Linux, you can just click on this and you get the software installed on your computer. So take note, we've added two more softwares, Putty and VNC Viewer. So I will power on my Raspberry Pi now and power on my network so that it will automatically connect to it, and I'll try to use Putty to connect to my Raspberry Pi remotely. Once you power up your Raspberry Pi, it should automatically search for your hotspot and connect to it. Before you can proceed, you have to make sure that your computer and your Raspberry Pi are on the same network, meaning that they are connected to the same wireless network. But if you also have a LAN internet cable, you can just use it to connect from the laptop to the Raspberry Pi directly without bothering about the wireless connection. this is also going to work. Before you can access the Raspberry Pi, we need to know the IP address of the Raspberry Pi. But most times the IP address do change, and you don't want to go through this stress of looking for the IP address. There's a way around it, and we're going to download another software called Apple Printer Services. You can search for Apple Printer Services. So you have to download Bonjour Print Services for Windows. Click on this and you click on download. Once you are done downloading this and you have it installed on your laptop, whenever you are connecting headlessly between your Raspberry Pi and your computer, the Raspberry Pi will automatically be giving you a name of Raspberry Pi.local. So instead of looking for the IP address of the Raspberry Pi, you can just type in Raspberry Pi.local and be able to access your Raspberry Pi even without knowing the IP address. So now I've already downloaded this and I have it installed on my computer. I've just opened up the software that I downloaded the other time, which is Putty. I'll click and search for Putty, and here, instead of looking for the IP address of the Raspberry Pi, because I have Bonjour Printer Services installed, I'll just type the host name Raspberry Pi.local. So I've typed in Raspberry Pi.local. I can click open, and this will ask me to log in. So we have to log in as the username that we gave the other time when we are setting up the user configuration. So just like you pass it in the userconf.text, I'm going to put in pi and password. So in this case, don't forget, when we put in the password, we put in the OpenSSL version of the password, but in this case you have to still put in the normal password, so which is Raspberry. And then I've successfully logged into my Raspberry Pi. Here I have pi at Raspberry Pi. So this is no more my computer, this is now the Raspberry Pi. So the first thing I will do before I run off the tutorial is to enable VNC so that we can see the graphical user interface of the Raspberry Pi. So I've typed in sudo raspi config. If I type this in and I will go to interface options, click enter and come down to VNC, which is the third option. Click this and click on enabled. Yes. So it says VNC server is enabled. So I can click on OK and click on finish. So I have VNC enabled now. So therefore I can view the graphical user interface of my Raspberry Pi. Again, we have to go back and open the VNC viewer that we downloaded the other time. So I'll just search for VNC viewer, click on this, and again I'm going to type in the host name, which is Raspberry Pi.local. So click enter. You can click on continue. So this will ask us for the username, which is pi, and I'll just put in the password again, which is Raspberry. And here I have my Raspberry Pi screen displayed. So that's it, guys. That's how you can set up your Raspberry Pi in headless form. The method that works in 2023 and will continue to work in as much as the protocol has not changed. So feel free to work around your Raspberry Pi, get to know more on what options you have, and you can start development once. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for joining me in this tutorial. If you find this tutorial helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share with whoever might need it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thank you.